Hello and welcome to Chess Please, and indeed welcome to chess, because today we're going to learn how to play chess for beginners. So if you've never played before, here is a great place to start. Now, whenever I'm playing a new card game or a new board game, the best tutorials always feature a dummy game where you play through a game, and by playing through that first initial kind of staged game, that's how you learn the rules of the game. And that's what we're going to do today. You and I are going to play a game of chess, and throughout I'll be explaining different concepts, how the different pieces move, how to check and checkmate the king, how to win the game, and by the end of it we'll have played a game and you'll know how to play. Sounds good? Happy days, let's jump in. So as we play through this game, we'll both be trying to coordinate our armies of pawns, knights, bishops, rooks, queens, and even our kings to control territory on the board, capture enemy troops, and overwhelm our opponent's defenses and checkmate our opponent's king. So you'll be playing as white, so you'll move first. Those are just the rules. White always moves first in this case. And we'll begin with the humble pawn. Now, in the normal course of things, a pawn can move one square ahead of itself in a straight line, one at a time, just gradually creeping their way up the board. Now, for each pawn's very first move though, they get an adrenaline boost and they have the option to move two squares ahead as they jump into battle. Now, you're a savvy player and you know that the center of the board is where most traffic passes through over the course of a game, and whoever controls the center controls that game. So you leverage your e-pawn's rush of blood to the head and leap into the fray. Now that it's my turn, I'm not just going to sit back and let you dictate things in the middle of the board. Chess is a two-player game after all, so I'm going to meet you right there in the middle with my own e-pawn. So we'll talk about capturing pieces a little bit more in just a second, but one thing that you should know about pawns is they are the only piece that attacks in a different direction to the way they actually move. It's just a unique thing about pawns. Pawns are quite unique, but pawns actually attack the two diagonal squares in front of them, and they don't attack the square directly in front of them. So our two pawns are now at loggerheads. Neither of them are actually able to attack each other, nor are they able to move through each other, and pawns don't know the meaning of the word retreat, so they can't move backwards. They are frozen together until further notice, just sort of gnawing at each other there. So it's back to your turn, and you decide to get more of your army into the mix, specifically your knight on g1. Now, you'll hear me referring to squares by their coordinates, and this is very simple to calculate. Basically, you'll see along the files that run up and down the board, they are lettered, and the ranks that run across the board are numbered. So each square is just its file followed by its rank. So in this case, G1. And the rest of the squares go like that. Just a nice easy way to talk about where you're moving pieces, where pieces are. Now, knights are a particularly fidgety piece, so let's clear the board and take a closer look at how they move. Knights are unique in a couple of ways. Firstly, they move in an L shape across the board, so they can move two spaces forward and one laterally, they can move two spaces laterally and one forward, and they can also back that thing up, so they can move two spaces backwards, one laterally, or one space backwards, two laterally. So a ton of different candidate moves, and this one isn't one that particularly logs in the head that easily like some of the other pieces we'll touch on. So knights are definitely a tricky one to handle. Now, another unique thing about knights is that they're the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So while everyone else needs to have a clear path to where they want to move, knights have no such concerns, making them very useful pieces to move out earlier because you don't need to clear the way for them. They can just jump right on into things. So coming back to our game, with your knight on g1, there are three possible places it can move to. It can go kind of sideways to e2, which you will often see this in games, but you don't want to block in your bishop just yet and get your knight in the way. It can jump to h3 on the side of the board, but knights are much more powerful toward the center of the board. Oftentimes you'll hear the adage knights on the rim are dim because they have much fewer squares that they can reach when they're on the side or corners of the board. So you generally want to move them closer to the center of the board where they can influence a lot more things. So in this particular case, you move your knight to f3, a fine move, a lovely home for that knight. And with that move, I see that on your next move, your knight could land on top of my pawn on e5 through one of its L-shaped moves. And if it did so, that would be capturing my pawn. So that would look a little bit like this, where the knight lands on top of the pawn is then cleared off of the board. You've essentially killed that pawn. I have one less soldier in my army to use, and your knight then takes its place standing on that square. So that's how captures work. And as I mentioned, knights, like all other pieces except for pawns, they attack the same way that they move. So if you land on a square, another opponent's piece is on, that's capturing. So the knight then stands on that square. Now, obviously, that's no good for me if you just take my pawn, so I'm going to defend it. Now, I can defend it with my d pawn if I just push that up one square, remembering that pawns attack diagonally. So now my pawn is supporting that pawn. If you captured with the knight, I would recapture with the pawn. And knights are more valuable than pawns, so that should be enough to scare you off from capturing my pawn right away. However, I'm also conscious that you're getting your army involved and you have a piece out in play, and I don't want to fall too far behind just making defensive moves as you charge on up the battlefield. So using what we've learned, can you see a way that I can bring one of my pieces into the battle while also defending the threat against my pawn? Have a quick look. If you spotted this knight move to c6, there was a very quick look, so no worries if you didn't spot that, I didn't really give you much time. But here my knight comes into the fray, so I'm developing my knight, I'm getting him into the mix, and I'm also defending that threat against the pawn. Now I'm going to pause here briefly because I mentioned there that knights are more valuable than pawns, and that's maybe a little intuitive just because pawns are the lowest of the low, but I'll give you a quick shorthand because we do have a sort of relative value that we assign to these pieces that helps us make decisions. So pawns are worth 1 point. Again, the lowest of the low, but they work very, very well together. Your knights and your bishops are worth 3 points. These are known as your minor pieces. They'll often be the kind of landing force for your attack. You're looking to control key squares in the opening. So they're worth 3 points each. Your rooks are worth 5 points each, and your queen is worth 9 points. Very, very powerful pieces. Your rooks and your queens known as your heavy pieces. Generally wait until, maybe some of the clutter in the middle of the board is cleared up. Kind of impose themselves a little later in the game, generally. The king doesn't really have a point value. He's kind of worth infinity points, kind of has golden snitch energy, where if you capture the king, you win the game. So he's kind of worth infinity, but also he's not that useful as an attacking piece himself. Those points don't really factor into like who wins and who loses. It's just a good shorthand for like knowing that you don't want to give away a rook for a knight unless other circumstances are in play. Anyway, that's just a quick briefing on the value of each pieces. Back to our game. So, I've developed my knight, you've developed your knight. You are determined to keep the pressure on, so you decide to bring another piece to the party, your bishop. Now let's have a quick look at how bishops move. Bishops move along diagonals. A lot more easy to get a handle on than knights. They can move as far as they want along a diagonal until they hit a wall or another piece. And they can also stop anywhere along that diagonal. Now, they can't move through their own pieces, so if you have one of your own pieces in the way of a bishop, it can't move past it. If there is an enemy piece in the way, it can move as far as that enemy piece, capture it and land on that square, but it can't go beyond that piece. Anyway, so bishops move along diagonals, and you'll notice that no matter how many moves I make with either of these bishops, with this bishop, it will always stay on the light squares because it can only move on those diagonals, which means that it will never land on a dark square. So we naturally call this my light squared bishop. And this bishop, alternatively, will move always on the dark squares, ergo we call that our dark squared bishop. So because of this, bishops often work best in pairs where their blind spots are covered by their colleague, and they're also great at attacking from long range, happiest on long diagonals, controlling many squares across the board. So that's a quick primer on bishops. Now coming back to our game and looking at your own bishops, the dark square bishop is still hemmed in by your own pawns. As I say, you can't capture or move through your own pieces, so he can't enter the action just yet. However, your light square bishop does have a clear path and makes its presence known on c4, a good active move into the center of the board. The process of moving your pieces from the back rank and into the fight is known as development, and this is a key priority during the opening phase of play. Your pieces are only valuable when they can influence the game, so you want to make sure that they are, as I say, in the mix. They're no good just hiding away at home. Now, my move, not wanting to fall too far behind in developing my own pieces, I think that move you made with your bishop is pretty good, so I'm going to move my bishop to the mirror square to c5. And things are starting to heat up in the center, a bit of pressure piling up, a bit more shrapnel there on the battlefield. Now, as that pressure builds in the center, another key priority of the opening phase of play is to get your king safe. As I say, if I can capture your king, the game is over. So you want to get him away from all the bric-a-brac and all the hustle and bustle of the centre of the board and move him to the safer pastures of the side of the board. Now you can do this with a special manoeuvre called castling. Now this is a very particular thing that you do with a king and a rook. So let's pull up the rooks. So castling is where your king and your rook kind of swap places a little and land beside each other. It's a great way to get your king out of the center of the board and also bring your rook closer into the game. We'll talk about rooks a little bit more, but castling, again, a very particular move, something you want to do early enough on in the game just so you don't get smashed in the face by some early checkmate tactics. It's a lot harder to get the king when he's over hemmed in by pawns and at the corner of the board. So castling also has a couple of rules attached. It's something you can only do once per game and only under certain conditions. So there can be no pieces between your king and your rook. It must be the first time that either your king or rook move, so they can't have moved before that. And your king cannot pass through any attacks. So if one of those squares was being attacked, let's say for example this bishop was staring down through one of the squares your king needs to move through, then you would not be allowed to castle through there. It has to be clear air for the king to move through, which is why, again, it's pretty advisable to do that early on before your opponent can get your pieces in place to stop you from castling. Now, while we have the rooks out, let's cover off how they move because, again, pretty straightforward. These beefy boys can move along ranks and files as far as they like. So very similar to bishops in that regard, but they go on straight lines. So either all the way up, all the way across, all the way back, all the way left or right. Again, as far as they have a clear line of sight, so they can move as far as their own piece or they can move into another piece of your opponent's and capture that piece and stop anywhere along the line that they would like to as well. So rooks in general, more involved later on in the game when there's not as much clutter on the board. They control a ton of squares, but they're not the most agile in tight spaces because they can't move on diagonals. So you want to try to place them. Probably you can happily keep these boys at home, but placing them on open or semi-open files where there's not as many pawns or not as much clutter in the way, so they can have a clear line of sight right down the board. That's where rooks are happiest. So back to our game. You're seeing all the pressure building in the center, so you do the prudent move and castle. Again, you're swapping your king and your rook there. Now, I want to keep developing my army, so I bring out my other knight. Just, again, getting him in the mix. In a similar vein, you keep up your development of your pieces. Again, you want to tend to bring your minor pieces out, so your knights and your bishops out before your rooks and your queens. So you bring out your next knight, happy days. I think castling is a great move too, so I decide to castle and get my king safe. Now you make the savvy move of pushing your D pawn, which does a couple of things. Firstly, it adds defense to your E pawn, so that can't be captured as easily if it starts to be attacked. And it also prepares your dark squared bishop to enter the fray by clearing the path. So I copy you because I'm running out of ideas and I think you're playing really well. Great job. So next, you bring your bishop to a very active square and attack my knight. And standing behind my knight is my queen. So let's quickly explain what she can do and what makes her the most powerful piece on the board, because she's vaguely involved in this move. So the queen can move as far as she likes along the diagonals, as well as along the files and the ranks, combining the abilities of both the bishop and the rook to become something more powerful than the two of them combined. This allows her to control a massive amount of squares at once, level threats against multiple pieces at the same time, and as such she'll often be the difference maker in who wins and who loses. So it's generally not advised to bring your queen out to the front lines early on in the game, where she can be bothered by pawns and minor pieces before any attack can really develop, because with the great power that she has comes great responsibility, as while she is a devastating force in attack, and you will learn that as you play games of chess. The queen is a very, very tricky customer. She must also be very wary of attacks against her, because she's so valuable to her army, so any attack against her kind of has to be reckoned with. You don't want to lose your queen for nothing, so it is a way for your opponent to kind of force your hand if they can attack your queen. So keep her at home as long as you can, or certainly unless you have a very good reason to bring her out into the mix. But back to your bishop move, we see our first tactical motif of the game, and this is where the kind of the juice of chess starts to make itself known. It's not just a matter of just moving the pieces, it's how it all comes together in a nice symphony. So your bishop is attacking my knight, and if my knight were to move, you would immediately capture my queen with your bishop. And going back to those values we talked about earlier on, queen is worth 9 points, bishop is worth 3. So that is a pretty handy trade for yourself to give up your bishop for my queen. So that basically means I do not want to move my knight so long as my queen stands behind it. And what we call that my knight is pinned to my queen. Your bishop is pinning my knight to my queen. And unless there are very specific circumstances, I'm not going to move that knight so long as my queen is there. So he's relatively immobile at the moment. And seeing this pin that you've leveled against my knight, I can't move him. I'm a little bit more nervous now of that happening. So I adopt a pretty passive approach. I develop my other bishop, which is good, and I defend my other knight. I just don't want that to happen on both sides of the board. So, I just make a little dainty move, push my bishop up to d7 there. But my position's starting to feel very slightly uncomfortable. Now, often when your opponent plays passively like this, that's a clear sign to hit the gas. So you sense my hesitation and you leap your knight into the beautiful central square of d5. Now we call this an octopus knight. A knight in the center of the board is an octopus knight because it has 8 squares that it can reach, visualized as 8 tentacles as it extends its influence across the board. Now this knight on d5, very crucially, heaps on the pressure on my pinned knight, which, as we said, cannot really move in good conscience without giving away our queen. So things are getting very, very sticky for that knight there. So there's not much I can do about that. So I rashly try to counterattack. I think, you know what? The side, the side where the king is over here, you've got a little bit of an advantage there, which often means I can maybe make a little hay on the queen side. Now this is a very misguided attempt. I just push out my b pawn. I think my pawn is going to attack your bishop, but it's a one move threat. It's a very thin threat. It's also a complete folly because my pawn has no backup, and you notice that. So your bishop can just capture my pawn with no drawbacks. That was an undefended piece. So making sure that once you're attacked, you don't automatically have to move your piece out of the way. You can have a look to see if it's being attacked or not. So your bishop can capture my pawn, no drawbacks, free stuff is free stuff. So we talked about how rooks move, and I want to put my rook on an open file. I can slide my rook across to the b file, just one square, but again putting him on that open file where he likes to be, technically threatening the bishop, but it's not really that dangerous because you can do what's known as defending your bishop again just by pushing your a pawn there. So you push your a pawn, and now what that means is if I were to capture your bishop with my rook, you would simply capture back with the pawn, and on balance a rook is worth 5 points, a bishop is worth 3 points. That's not a trade you want to enter into lightly. So that pawn defending the bishop should be enough to scare me away from capturing that bishop. So a very simple way of defending that. Now this is all getting a bit complicated, but that's chess, and we're just learning how the pieces move and how they interact with each other. So I liked how you jumped your knight into the mix, so I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to jump my knight into your territory and reveal not one but 2 attackers on your bishop. My knight and my bishop now stare down your bishop as well as the rook as well. So that pressure is starting to build quite substantially. However, you're looking at the whole board here. The chess is played on the whole board, and what you want to look at here is what pieces of yours are doing a lot of work and what pieces aren't doing that much work. And then again, you want to look at my pieces. Which of my pieces are doing great work and which pieces aren't doing so well. So you think to yourself that my knight in the center of the board there, that's a very powerful piece, one of those octopus knights we talked about earlier. And that your knight there on f3, he's okay, but he's not doing great, but he's doing fine. So you understand that you can initiate a trade between your okay knight and my great knight. And listen, getting something great off the board in exchange for getting something okay off the board, that works out in your favor. So you capture my great knight with your okay knight, and I capture back with my bishop. I'm nominally putting pressure here on your b pawn, but my goose is nearly cooked. There's actually a lot more going on than I've been conscious of at this stage. So you start to turn the screw a little more and you uncork another trade. So you capture my pinned knight with your bishop. Now, normally it can be a good idea to leave a pinned piece where it is. My knight wasn't going to be doing anything so long as the queen stood behind it. So often what you want to do is build up pressure on that piece, like you did by jumping your knight in there and also attacking the knight. But in this case, you've got grander designs than just building pressure. So you capture my knight with your bishop, and I don't want to capture back with the queen, which I could do, but then you would just capture my queen with your knight. Again, a 3-piece knight for a 9-piece queen. No, thank you very much. So you capture back with the pawn, and that's a fair trade. My bishop for your knight. Fair trade, but not quite, because you've now opened up a gaping hole in front of my king. My king is looking pretty exposed there along the g-file, and that's going to come into play in just a moment. So I've captured back with my pawn, and now it's your turn again. I'm very much on the back foot here, and you're not done with violence just yet. So you capture my bishop on d7 with your own bishop. Now this looks maybe just like a normal trade, maybe not even that good a trade for you. Your bishop was a lot more active, a lot more advanced than my bishop. So trading those bishops off, where you capture my bishop and I capture back your bishop with my queen, might seem like not so great a trade for yourself. However, it's not so much about the material that gets traded there, but what happens after the trade, i.e. I need to capture back your bishop, and when I do so with my queen, I move my queen to d7, and that's just a very important little distinction. The queen is now on d7, and we move on to our next tactical motif of the game, which is the devastating knight fork. So I've captured back your bishop with my queen, and now you uncork the devastating knight takes on f6, and in one fell swoop you're attacking both my king and my queen with your knight at the same time. This double attack is known as a fork or a knight fork, and as you're learning chess, this will be both the bane of your existence and also one of the main tools in your arsenal for winning games. Knight forks are really fiddly to think of and to avoid. So definitely file this one away. And what's more is that one of the pieces under attack in this case is my king, the head honcho who we need to keep safe at all costs. So attacking the king, as you've done so here, is known as check, or putting the king in check. Check is a pretty important element of the game, and it has certain implications on what I can do and what I can't do. So let's take a quick look at what check means. Now, other than castling, we haven't really spoken about the king, which makes sense because once you get him safe at the start of the game, he'll often stay out of the action until the bitter end. From a movement perspective, the king can move one square in any direction. So kind of like the queen insofar he can move in any direction, but just that he's incredibly out of shape. So just one square in any direction. But this does make him a wriggly enough customer all the same. Now, when your king is attacked or in check, you legally have to respond by getting him out of check. And if you don't, or you can't do so, that's when check turns into checkmate. If your king has no ways of escaping check, that's checkmate. So how do we escape check? There are 3 ways in which you can escape a check. The first is simply to move your king out of the line of fire. So just getting out of the way of a square that's attacked and that has him in check. And note that you, again, legally cannot move your king into check. So you can't move him into an attacked square. So you'll have to find a safe square that isn't attacked for him to go. The second way to escape a check is to block that check, to block the line of sight between the attacking piece and your king, putting some piece in the way of the attack. A very useful one, but note that this won't work for a knight attack because, as we mentioned earlier on, knights can jump over different pieces, so there's no way to block a knight because the knight isn't going to go on the ground, basically. So knight checks cannot be blocked. The third way to stop a check or to escape a check is if you're lucky enough to be able to capture the piece that is leveling the check. So that means if you are in check like this and you actually happen to be able to capture there with your rook, happy days, the piece no longer exists to offer a check, so your king is no longer in check. That's the third way. The best way probably if you have the luxury of being able to capture that piece. But all of these come with very specific circumstances, so be very conscious of how you avoid a check if you can. So with all these different ways to escape a check, landing a checkmate where the king has no moves, no blockers, and no counter captures can be a tricky enough endeavour and often requires multiple pieces acting in harmony, which is why that development phase of bringing all your pieces to the party at the beginning of the game is so important. It's very hard to just checkmate with one piece. You need a few pieces coordinating together. Okay, so back to our game. You've just captured my pawn, you've put my king in check, and you've attacked my queen. Not bad at all for just one move. Since I can't capture your knight with anything, I have nothing that's pointing at your knight right now. The knight cannot be blocked by anything, there's nothing I can put in the way. That means that I'll have to move my king out of the way. So I figure I'll throw an attack at the knight. I'll move my king into the knight's grill and maybe draw a little bit of a sword there. But it's your turn again. I haven't had time to move my queen, so you capture her free of charge. And that is a devastating blow. As I say, the queen worth 9 points of material. There isn't like a scoreboard in chess. This is just a good rule of thumb to understand, like, are you winning or are you losing? Often comes down to how much material you have left. And I mean, if you lose a queen for no compensation, it generally is not a good thing. So not only have you captured my queen free of charge, you've also unlocked a new fork because you were attacking both of my rooks at the same time. Again, rook's worth 5, knight's worth 3, so I can't move both my rooks out of the way. So this is going from bad to worse for me. Now I figure, since I can't save both of my rooks, I may as well launch a counterattack by capturing your b pawn that I've long threatened, but it's far too little too late. My forces are scattered, I'm way down on material, and my king is wide open. So, all that said, you start to ring the death knell by finally moving your queen into the game along the diagonal to g4, staring right down the barrel of my king on g4 and putting my king in check there. And things are starting to get very, very hairy for me. So, I've really lost the thread here. I tried to seek refuge in the corner of the board, but my king now has to leave the defense of the rook. So once again, your knight can wreak havoc and escape with his life by capturing that rook. It's all going to hell. You're playing very, very well, I have to say, and I'm playing pretty poorly. I've really lost the thread now. So I bring my rook back home and try to lend some semblance of support to the king and attack this knight. You get your knight out of dodge and attack my rook for good measure. That is a good way to do things in chess, where you can move your piece away from danger and also attack another piece. This is a tempo move. You're taking the initiative from me because I've got to respond to that now. I've got to make a defensive or a reactive move. In this case, my rook has had enough of your knight and tries to chase him away again, and you happily oblige. You put your knight on the very dangerous f6 square. So, given all that and given how little hope I have left, I figure that your queen is far too close for comfort, and I try to chase her away with my rook. But if you're looking closely, this is absolute madness, a terrible move by me, a complete blunder. Can you see why it was such a mistake? And I'll give you a hint. As it happens, you now have checkmate in one move. So try to see if you can find it. Try to see if you again, I've understood checkmate enough to know where checkmate is here. So, the killing blow comes with the queen capturing the rook on g8. Now, this is checkmate because my king has nowhere to move where it wouldn't be in check. There are no pieces to block the check from the queen. And crucially, my king cannot capture the queen because then it would be walking into a check from the knight, which legally kings cannot move into check. So, can't capture the queen, there's nowhere to go, nothing to block. That's checkmate. You've done it. Congratulations. You are a natural. You've won your very first game. And I've been playing this game a long time. And you wiped the floor with me. So fair play to you there. Just to recap, we learned how the pawns move straight ahead, twice on their first move if they like, and attack the diagonals in front of them. We learned how the knights move in L-shaped patterns, jumping over any pieces in their way. We learned that bishops control diagonals and never leave the colour that they start on. Rooks cruise along files and ranks as far as they wish and are great enforcers in later stages of the game. And the queen, the most powerful piece, combining the moves of a rook and a bishop to wreak havoc up and down the board. The king himself, stubby and stubborn, moves one square in any direction, but has to keep himself out of danger at all costs. We learn the importance of getting your pieces into the action early on. We also learn some basic tactical motifs like pinned pieces and knight forks. And finally, we learned about check and checkmate and how they bring about victory and defeat. So that is basically how you play chess. There are definitely a ton more things to learn. There are a couple of rules that I didn't go over, like if you get a pawn all the way to the end, you can turn it into a queen, which is amazing. So for next steps, I actually recommend creating an account on either chess.com where I play or Lichess, which is a little bit more of an open software, openware kind of solution. I have an account on both. They're both pretty good, so no preference there, Lichess or chess.com. But create a free account and start playing some 10-minute games against other real people, just to get a feel for things. Don't worry about making silly mistakes or not knowing what you're doing. You're only going to be matched against people of a similar rating range, so all the people you're playing against are likely going to make some similar silly mistakes, and you're all just learning to play the game. So definitely be kind to yourself, have some patience, and try to enjoy, because there really is no real better teacher than like actual game experience. So just play a few games, make a few silly mistakes, lose a few games, and eventually you'll start to catch that bug. For more content on like beginner and intermediate tips for playing chess, just interesting things I find about the game of chess, feel free to subscribe and stick around and let me know what kind of tips and tricks you think might be helpful as you're getting to learn the game. But check out my back catalogue of general openings, general tips and tricks to help you get more of a flavour of what chess is like once you get the basics down. Finally, as a general bit of advice, try to laugh off any of the silly mistakes or blunders that you'll make along the way. As I say, I've been playing for years and years and I still make elementary mistakes at times. Chess is very tricky, but ultimately it is a super rewarding and enjoyable game. Really helps keep the brain sharp, really scratches a nice puzzling itch in the brain. And there's an amazing community both online and in person. You will meet people from all walks of life that play chess, that love chess. Most people that play chess love chess, I'll be honest. So that is going to be all from me, folks. Hope you've enjoyed that. Have a great day, and most importantly, enjoy your chess. Cheers. All the best.